Thank you everyone for inviting me here today to give you a presentation. On behalf of Thane Harpole, who co-created this presentation, I am happy to share with you our research on 17th century land patents in Abingdon Parish, Gloucester County. Particularly, we're going to focus today on the speculation, settlement, and the method of getting to church on Sundays, as we're happy to help celebrate the Abingdon Church anniversary and, as part of a lecture series, contribute to our greater understanding of this wonderful parish that we all know and many of us live in. So on the cover slide, I always like to start off by giving people a bit of information that really brings to bear exactly what we're trying to do. We're trying to answer questions. In this case, this is part of a master's thesis I wrote back in the early 2000s. And I found that the easiest way to find the answers was to take on a rather ambitious project of reconstructing all of the land patents for Gloucester County, specifically Abingdon Parish in Gloucester County in the 17th century. And these included a lot of documents that had not been compiled before, but that most of you as researchers have been exposed to in some form or another. Or as genealogists, you've seen these names because you've all been looking for them and their families and trying to find connections. With this one, what you'll see are a series of about 6 land patents that actually mention roads. And to this day, I continue to find myself wonderfully fascinated with roads, particularly as they often go counter to the narrative that a lot of us use when describing the evolution of sites in 17th century and 18th century Virginia. As many of you know, they would say the roads are the waterways. Essentially, that most people were traveling along the water, and water was more of a highway, and it really underscores the emphasis most of us place on maritime traffic. And it's not to say that that is not important, but what's often left behind is this idea that roads were not as developed or important as they actually were. And so in this graphic alone, you can see in the 1660s and the 1650s, even in the 1640s, that there are references to roads in existence that many of us know today. And so part of this is built around the idea of trying to identify the present and the past and where they overlap. And in particular, the Great Road, Route 17, the Indian Path, one that seemingly draws a spine along the center of the parish as it goes from Gloucester Point up towards the courthouse. These roads form the interconnected tissue that bond together so many of the individuals living in Gloucester County and across colonial Virginia. It seemed like a good place to start. And especially when you're looking at from the perspective of a church situated almost exclusively on those roads as opposed to along the water, you would imagine how the people would get here and how the roads might be quite popular amongst the local community for getting to and from this required element of everyday life. So I really don't like to read slides because I figure most folks have the ability to read them and to understand them, and so this second slide ends up having quite a bit of text to it. I think it's mostly for reference, and since I know this will be posted online, it gives a lot of good information that people can hunt down at a later date. So I'm just going to leave it here for quite a few seconds, and then we'll move on. What I do like to emphasize is that this information will fill in some of the gaps that we'll talk about as the rest of the presentation proceeds. Also, there are certain numbers and other things on this slide, in particular the archaeological site numbers. That's the number you see with the 44, the GL, and then a 4-digit number after that. These are specific references to sites within the state's inventory of archaeological sites. So that just gives you a little bit more background and some of the code, if you will, to how historians and archaeologists look at the landscape. Slide. So most of our introductions to the settlement of Gloucester County writ large, and oftentimes the greater Chesapeake Bay area, is looking at something called the Map of Virginia and Maryland, drawn by a man named Herman. It was published in 1673, and for a lot of us, it's this first understanding of just how populous the area around southeastern Virginia was. And the map continues all the way up into Maryland and on the eastern shore. But in the focus on Gloucester, it gives us a couple of creek names. It also gives us small little dots and illustrated house symbols that tell us where people were living. The difficult part about this kind of map is that it's an introduction to accuracy in cartography in the early to mid 17th century. A product of cartographers where the intent was not to essentially drive your car from one place to the other. I mean, I would hazard that using this as part of your GPS would leave you very wet or very much in the middle of the woods. What the map was intended to communicate was more of an advertisement for settlement. It was intended to go ahead and to show that there were quite a few settlements in certain portions of Virginia, and also was a bit of a road map in the sense of being able to tell which creeks were where and who they were named after, where were the major landmarks. And so when traveling from point A to point B, you might be able to use those as a common element that you could communicate with others about. On the right-hand side of this image, you'll see the locations of 17th century sites that are within the state's inventory. The inventory is just a list of sites that are contributed by individuals, mostly private individuals, but sometimes companies that are doing cultural resource management, or even students who are doing research projects. Some of them are on the National Register of Historic Places, but it generally gives you a sense of just how much we know. And when we compare the small little symbols on the Herman map to the 17th century period sites that you see on the right-hand map, you can see just how great a disparity there is between the two. We know very little in the grand scheme of things when it comes to the 17th century in Gloucester County, and only a fraction of the sites where people were living are known. We hope to learn a lot more in the years to come, but this does make sure to give us a proper perspective when we start talking about how confident we are with the conclusions that we make. We are lucky enough to know several home sites for early patentees, and because those often are associated with other documents, we can learn a bit more about people beyond the patentees by knowing that the archaeology and the documentary resources are connected to a place in space. Now, the next slide here clearly shows the initial reconstruction of land patents I was able to do between the period between the years 1639 and 1650. The reason I chose this period is because Abingdon Parish was still a part of York County. For those of you who don't remember, obviously because none of you were alive then, but York County was the mother county for Gloucester County up until Gloucester was formed out of it in 1651. And the best part about this map is that it pretty comprehensively shows that there were large portions of the county that had not been settled yet. There is always the chance that there were patentee gaps that are likely a result of a missing patent or two. But by and large, this gives you a great understanding of how the landscape was divvied up by this initial run of settlement in that first decade or so of occupation. And so some of the names you see are fairly familiar, but over the years I've heard a lot of folks talk about people who are on this map, including Stephen Gill, who patented adjacent to the Menifee patent, further up Carter Creek, and eventually subdivided his parcels and sold them to others. There's Nicholas Stillwell, who owned property right close to Route 17 to us over time, and even Francis Seeley, and I think I'm pronouncing that right. The last name is spelled C-E-E-L-Y, although it's certain that that last name has been spelled many different ways over time. All of these individuals have become somewhat prominent in the 17th century history of Gloucester County and are deserving of further research. On the next slide, we return back to that one at the cover, or the beginning of the presentation. We know that there were roads that the indigenous peoples in Gloucester developed prior to contact with Europeans. And when settlement occurred, there was certainly the approach that Europeans took when recognizing the utility of those paths. In some cases, bolstering them, improving them. You did have surveyors for the county, and you did have those who were tasked with maintaining the roads, especially as you got to the end of the 17th century and into the 18th century. At the same time that you have quite a bit of reliance on those for establishing a value for the inland lands. You can see the rather massive land patent that extends essentially from Carter Creek all the way through to Route 17 that is owned by Lewis Burrell. That one is so massive that you have a hard time imagining how we may have gotten tobacco and other crops from one end of the patent all the way down to the other end and out to the ships that would have brought it over to England. And yet the roads were one method for doing so. And in other cases, some of this land was an investment, knowing that there would be additional settlement. The inner lands may not have been as worthwhile as the coastline, but they would have had value, and those values could have been turned into cash, could have been turned into tenant farmers who would have been working for the Burrells, and many prominent property owners would go ahead and patent large acreages, if only to possess that acreage. Owning thousands and thousands of acres was certainly a status symbol during this time. On this next slide, you can see the preceding generation, or at least the first decade of the second half of the 17th century, the first decade of Gloucester County, if you will. And it just gets complicated. It's why it's difficult sometimes to go ahead and make sense of some of the maps unless you're looking for a very particular area or a very specific individual. And so you'll have over 30 names of patentees, and this is only a small cross-section of the larger population in Abingdon Parish. Because in each of these, you likely had wives, children, sometimes other relatives that were living on the property. You would have tenant farmers who would not necessarily be listed on the patent, except for perhaps as a headright. And then you might have enslaved individuals, because even at this early stage of settlement within the Chesapeake, you do have some references to the enslaved, particularly those where headrights were claimed. And so at 50 acres per headright, the value of the enslaved simply increased exponentially, knowing that you had both of their labor for a long period, as well as acreage that would have been made to put under the plow and then eventually brought profit. The more interesting part for me when I look at a map like this is the difference between the absentee or speculator property owner, the resident, and those who are unknown. And so what I've done here is I've tried to highlight in light green along the border of the patents whether or not the person was an absentee or a speculator, whereas if it was a tan outline, you would likely know that they would be residents. And so it highlights that Augustine Warner and John Robbins, some of the folks whose names would persist in the community, are essentially making their stake or staking their claim in this area, and their names associated with the land is a reflection of their being here in person, as opposed to purchasing land while residing in other counties or not even in the colony. Moving on to the next decade, and this is just a quick breeze through, since it's hard for a lot of folks to get connected with each of these without pausing the presentation and zooming in quite closely. You'll see that it just continues to see a growth in the types of patents. The size of the patents decrease, and certainly the numbers increase. More important than that, when I'm looking at the patents that you see here, you do see some consistent gaps. The Perrin River in particular is one that I wanted to highlight. If you're looking at the map, it's not listed as the Perrin River or the Perrin Creek, but it's immediately above the word York River in the image. And you can see that it's somewhat absent, any reference to who actually was patenting that acreage, and it would have been quite strange for that to have been unpatented. So this one is most certainly a lost patent. We know eventually that it is patented, but it's not until the end of the 17th century that occurs. And so the larger question is, well, who had it before then, and why didn't their patent survive? And with so many folks curious about the area of Gloucester County, also known as Guinea, but also the association of the Perrin family, particularly with Little England, which is on the west end of that white peninsula that is coasting along the York River. You can understand how doing more research into that would have been or will be quite informative, not just to those who are descended from the family, but also those who have been doing research in Gloucester and Guinea for some time. I've added a few other elements here. You can notice that Fort James, which is the name of the fort at Gloucester Point, is highlighted. There's also the Glebe House, which is on the northern border of Abingdon Glebe, which also served Ware Parish for quite some time. That's why its location is there. And then also the warehouse The warehouse, again, was another very important building at Gloucester Point. It's where tobacco inspection took place and where you would have seen quite a bit of investment, especially when folks knew that to export their tobacco from the colony and not go through the warehouse would have provided potential fines and additional costs that many could not afford. The other delightful part about this is that occasionally you will get the tidbit of genealogical information. So if you can see on the left-hand side the list of names, you can see some variations in how they were spelled, but you can also see that some patentees are referred to as deceased. And so as that search for all of the little bits of information that might help us understand how these individuals lived their lives, sometimes having a known period when someone was dead, as morbid as that might sound, is quite essential. You can also see that there were occasionally folks who collaborated. And I like to highlight Augustine Warner and John Robbins working together. They decided to go ahead and to take the Free School Creek area and patent it together. And so while John Robbins was on the east side of Robbins Neck and Augustine Warner was on the northwest branch of the Severn River, they thought, okay, the best thing for us is to purchase the land in between, or in this case, patent the land in between, and therefore control even more so the commerce and agriculture and frankly, even the maritime industry that is surrounding this significant portion of Gloucester County's Abingdon Parish. The other part to note is that both of these were prominent political individuals, and so part of growing one's empire would also mean controlling a lot of the acreage that was surrounding your house, even if you didn't own it outright. So joint ownership is quite interesting. Now, I've gone a little bit further into looking at specific 17th century sites of research in the last few years for my organization. And so the left-hand image that you see on this new slide shows some of the patents that we had talked about in the previous images, but I've kind of brought in some stark coloring to make it easier for us to focus. On the right-hand side, I've gone ahead and shown in a more clear manner those 3 necks of land that were originally part of the green Menifee patent, and highlighted some of the 17th century sites that were a part of these. It's important for us to go ahead and to look at these in space, because when you're talking about the settlement and you understand that this huge 3,000 acre patent was only patented by a single individual, and he didn't even live on it, that most of what you end up talking about for sites from this period are the people that you wouldn't have associated with the pews that you are now sitting in. Instead, you would have associated these with the tenant farmers, potentially the enslaved, possibly other individuals who brought to the properties as indentured servants and labored on behalf of the Menifees. Some of you may recognize the locations as their current names are known. So the site in the bottom right-hand corner, 44 GL 456, is the Timberneck House. This map shows that there is a 17th century component that far predates the house. The house was built around 1793. If you go up to the left a wee bit, you'll end up seeing the Shelley Archaeological District. We know that there was certainly a major contact period Native American village there. That's what's the polygon 44 GL 318 represents. But there is a small site, you can see it labeled 44 GL 319, that represents an early mid-17th century settlement by indentured servants or the enslaved. And then just across Carter Creek from there, you'll see 2 sites, both of them associated with where we know as Rosewell Plantation. In both cases, this predates the Page family's ownership, and both of them include components associated most likely with the indentured or the enslaved of the 17th century. Just for fun, we've thrown in the Burrell family property Fairfield, which is at the very top of the image. That's 44 GL 24. I cannot go a presentation without highlighting the one place I love the most. Now, to give you some general context about how the 17th century changed over time, what we've done here is included a couple of charts that show essentially the growth in the export of tobacco, but also the growth in the import of enslaved Africans to Virginia. And then down below, you can see how in some periods, we hit this switch, particularly between the servants per inventory and the enslaved per inventory. There's no perfect map or chart or statistic to explain it, so the graphic that you see in the bottom center is from York County, one of Virginia's counties with the best preserved records from the 17th century. But you can clearly see that shortly after the 1680s, the number of references to servants declined to the degree that the number of enslaved referenced in those inventories increased. And so we often look at that period between the 1670s and the 1690s, the kind of area that brackets that particular decade shift, really helps us understand when we changed as a society in the Chesapeake, from one where you were working with the enslaved to one where the enslaved dominated, where the enslaved were the ones responsible for the majority of work, and where in most cases finding sites of people who were laboring on the property, people who are responsible for agricultural production. At that stage, you're no longer talking as much about the indentured servants who dominate much of Virginia's mid and early 17th century narrative. And instead, you're talking about slavery, something that certainly dominates the 18th and early 19th century narrative of Virginia history. On the next slide, we kind of bring a few more graphics to bear. What you see on the left are tiny little squares that mark where excavation units were done by Tony Opperman and Randy Turner, who were then part of the Department of Historic Resources. And they were investigating what they found at the Shelley property. Site 319 is an area they found artifacts that seemed to suggest the mid-17th century occupation, and they thought, hey, this would be a great way to learn more about an understudied part of colonial Virginia's history. And so they put in about 25 test units. These are, for reference, about 3 feet square, with the hope of exposing parts of a building's foundation or parts of trash pits or ditches or other things that might help understand what it was like to live in the 17th century, the mid-17th century, as an indentured servant or as an enslaved individual, which was their hypothesis when they approached the site and its excavation. In the end, they were able to compile quite a bit of information through the artifacts, and so some of that I can discuss here. By the way, on the right, this is a 1937 aerial, so it's about as early as we can get with aerial photographs, and it shows basically the same conditions as what you see today, and that is agricultural field, and it continues to be as such. So I'm highlighting a little bit more here. You can see on the left that there's a profile of the feature that they cross-sectioned. There's a ditch. Sometimes these ditches are for drainage, but more often they're used to show the boundaries of domestic spaces. On the right, you can see quite a few of these dark, small squares within slightly larger tan squares. These are posts in the ground, kind of like when you build a fence, but in this case, you're putting vertical beams into the ground to support a building. It's what's called a post-in-ground structure. It's very common for the 17th century, and very often associated with people of the lower and middling classes. Sometimes even the wealthiest of people were using post-in-ground structures, but in this case, the artifacts suggest this is not the wealthiest group. You can see in test units 20 and 18, there's something more substantial to the north, but their focus wasn't looking for artifacts or digging into cellars. Their point was to go ahead and to better understand where there would be domestic spaces and having just enough of a sample of artifacts so that they could justify the site's perpetual preservation. And luckily at the Shelley Archaeological District, and thanks to them and the property owner at the time, Cecil Ray Page Jr., this site is preserved in perpetuity. Now, the artifacts that you see on the right, there are a selection of things in the upper section where the photograph shows everything from gunflints to German stoneware to tobacco pipe fragments and even the tip of a projectile point. In the bottom right-hand corner, you can see a collection of both white clay and red clay tobacco pipe stems. In the mid-17th century, they're about 50-50 on the percentage, particularly for poor or middling class households. The red clay ones are manufactured here locally in the Chesapeake, whereas the white ones are more frequently imported from England and occasionally from Holland. In the lower left-hand corner is perhaps the most fascinating artifacts for us that we've seen. What we can see is a very low-fired earthenware. And in the Chesapeake, a lot of times folks are curious about the more locally produced ceramics and other forms of folk culture. The red clay pipes are certainly one example, and you'll see a few more images to come. But in this case, this pottery is more of the shape of bowls or cups or larger containers, and its manufacture is often a reflection of the knowledge of those individuals who made it. The question of who made it is the bigger issue. This is not often seen on sites of this period. It's more often seen on indigenous sites, and so there is some conjecture that these are indigenous ceramics that are essentially purchased by poorer folk from the surviving indigenous community and then brought here and used, broken and discarded. Others suggest that these are actually a reflection of the increase in the number of enslaved Africans who are in the Chesapeake, because it's their ceramic traditions that are reflected by these pieces. Still others think that this is a reflection of essentially just expediency by anyone of a lower class, whether they're white, black, or indigenous. And so it's an early form, something that is a little different from what we see in the 19th and 18th centuries, but also a little different from what we see from the period before contact with Europeans. And so we're still studying these and trying to see just exactly where they are found, how often we find them with people of this class level, and then perhaps maybe we'll find one day evidence of where they were manufactured so we could say, yes, these are made by a specific person. In this next image, you can also see more of these. It seems almost like they're little bits of just hardened dirt. I mean, this is not the most sophisticated ceramic, because you can imagine how difficult it would be to make them. Essentially finding clay, making the clay as pure as you can, but also then firing the clay often in an open fire, and then treating this relatively fragile dish or cup or bowl in a way that allows it to be of use for you for some time. There's not a significant amount of temper, but you can see small little gaps. That's normally where crushed shell would have been, but have since leached away. There's also small little freckles of red. This is the hematite that naturally occurs within the soil of the Chesapeake, and particularly here in Gloucester County. In the right-hand side, you can see some close-up details of some of the artifacts that we found related to smoking tobacco. The lower center section, you can see LE for a pipe likely made by Llewellyn Evans in that mid to late 17th century period. He was making thousands and thousands of pipes in England, and his symbol and his maker's mark is quite common. In the upper center section, though, you can see some very intricately decorated, punctate decorated red clay tobacco pipes. These are being made and potentially made for sale at different spots across the Chesapeake. And while some have conjectured that they are local to the sites that they are found, others are thinking that it's a cottage industry and that there are quite a few folks out there making them in such volume that they could be sold to others. Now we're going to shift a little across Cedar Bush Creek. We're going to look at a site that's now on Machicomico State Park, where a rather massive excavation was undertaken in the late 2000s, with the hope of identifying the 17th century settlement in this location. On the one side, the excavation area you see highlighted by the kind of very light green box, essentially was meant to mitigate the impacts of a house that was planned for construction there, that was, by the way, never built. But you can see all of the other dots, the reds, the blacks, the greens. These are all additional testing that was done because to the left of that green box is a substantial Native American village. And the hope was that they would be able to avoid future impacts in this area and preserve it for the general public now that it's owned by the state of Virginia. As we zoom in a little bit more specifically, you can see some of the challenge that archaeology brings to bear is that when you do a lot of testing, you end up having a lot of different conclusions, and in some cases, a lot of evidence of archaeology more so than evidence of the past. So what we're going to do is kind of focus in just on the one excavation. And this is that green box that you saw before. Now, the multicolored boxes you see quite large on the page. This is just representing where people had previously dug. Also shows you how easy it is to go ahead and to miss, even if you're using a randomized sample. But you can see some of those more amorphous dark blobs further to the south and a little bit to the north and east. Lots of the purple ones, those are smaller features that ended up not being cultural, the evidence of things like plow scars or tree roots or those kind of things. But the other ones did have quite a few artifacts in them and seemed to be part of disposal patterns related to a house site that was not in this area. So the house site seems to survive someplace else, just not here. And in those pits were the items you see in front of you now. In this slide, you can see on the left more of the white imported tobacco pipe bowls. In the lower right, you can see some of the marked heels of those tobacco pipe bowls. Sometimes they're on the insides, or the kind of view that one would have if one was smoking the pipe. And the initials are often a mark of the pipe makers and kind of helped advertise the business that they had. What's curious is not that the locally made pipe bowls in the upper right image are of a similar size and shape, because this was still fashion and there was a lot of copying and a lot of trying to produce products that were recognizable to the market that was here in the Chesapeake, but rather the fact that they include intricate designs and a lot of really wonderful artwork that is reflective of the individuals who were here in the Chesapeake at that time. Some claim that these tobacco pipes were made by the enslaved. Others claim that they were made by the indigenous cultures, as both the indigenous people of Virginia, their ancestors, as well as the ancestors of the enslaved, have very similar tobacco pipes that were produced in other locations, namely Africa and elsewhere on earlier sites in Virginia. And still others are known to have produced pipes like this, particularly Europeans. There was one individual who was essentially known as the bookbinder. And he's given that name because he's using his previous occupation as someone who bound books to go ahead and take tools and other devices to go ahead and to mark the tobacco pipes with interesting shapes and other motifs. The ones that you see in front of you here, they all seem to be made perhaps by the same maker. They're all stars, and they all have this white crushed powder clay worked into their design, some of which survives in place. And so you can imagine how amazing this would have looked if someone was showing it to another, and essentially you'd have this reddish brown tobacco pipe that was smoke was billowing out of and that would smell of sweet scented tobacco, and then you would see this white inlay of a starburst pattern, and it would be quite the impressive display. Now at the same site, which contrasts quite significantly with what we found over at the Shelley site, you'll see more recognizable forms and larger artifacts. What you see in the upper left-hand corner are two images of a three-legged pot. Lower left-hand corner, you can see a Bartmann Krug, which is a German bottle, oftentimes associated with the characterization of Bishop Bellarmine's face, although it's frankly just a bearded man with a medallion that's beneath him. And then the often found tin-glazed earthenware that's beneath that, blue and white, emulating Chinese porcelain, but not quite getting it right. On the right is the perhaps rarest artifact that we had found in the collection, and this is a ceramic tile, often associated with floors and not of the poor, more often associated with things like churches or the homes of the elite, maybe even courthouses. In this case, there's only a single fragment that was found, and it's fascinating because it's just not something that's commonly associated with sites of the poorer folk, particularly because they simply didn't need it. But this may have been a show of aspirations towards higher status, or simply a convenient find brought to the site and then used in front of the hearth, a flat surface on which to work things and, frankly, to make life easier. And so we've talked about these potential 17th century sites, these earlier mid-17th century sites. We've talked a little bit about how life would have been different for the lesser sort, those who didn't have a tremendous amount of wealth or a pew within a miraculously wonderful church like this. And so we're looking at the homes and asking ourselves, how could we learn more? What of the record books, what of the archaeological record, how can we pursue this? And some of it goes back to learning about how we can see the more complete picture of society in the Chesapeake of the 17th century. And with Abingdon in particular being often cast aside because its colonial records are largely lost, we believe there's still quite a bit that could be learned from being here. And so this attempt to take this variety of different documents that are strewn all over and pull them together, is the kind of foundational element that we're thinking would hopefully lead to more research, more investment, particularly when working with people who are interested in the field of archaeology, anyone from 12 to 86 years old, but also to work with people who are looking to see value in how we spend our time and how we see these investments in the community bring forth for a great benefit to everyone. And so as we look to this next slide, I just want to give a quick summary of where circumstance and that investment in people looking into the past can really prove to be a truly wonderful experience. And it kind of leads into the work that we're doing now at the church in the southern section of the cemetery. Many of you may remember in 2003 that Hurricane Isabel came through the area and knocked down a tree in the cemetery. And when you look at an image like the one on the right, you'll notice that the trees have grown quite a bit, and that small trees like this, it used to be, much smaller. What we wanted to highlight is that this was quite a shocking discovery. When David Peebles brought Thane Harpole and I here, I think we were both 28 years old. We had just started the Fairfield Foundation in 2000, and we said, okay, let's go ahead and help and see what we can understand about this circumstance, this chance finding of a brick foundation. David was mostly concerned about whether or not it was a burial vault and didn't want any harm to be had with any of the human remains that would have been there. And so our initial tactic was to consult with the state of Virginia and to fill out what's called an anticipatory burial permit, which allows us to essentially do excavations with all the parties knowing that we're not looking for dead people. We're just looking to make sure that if we end up finding displaced human remains, that we can make sure that they're treated appropriately. So as you can see on the right, that's Thane Harpole squatting down in the trench, a trench that was essentially created by the tree stump falling over. In the center section of the photo, you can see the bottom of a wine bottle, as well as a couple of fragments of tobacco pipe and a small sliver of window glass. As we move on to the next one, you can see more clearly the two photographs that show surviving sections of what we would later learn was the original churchyard wall. As you leave the church today, or as you visit in the future, you can see that two sections of the current churchyard wall are actually remnants of the earlier half-acre churchyard wall associated with the donation of Augustine Warner in the 1650s. The section we see here is kind of inside. It's not near where this bench once was, and it's essentially demarcating that half-acre space, and we're quite close to where an opening would have been, where people would have been walking through into the churchyard where the 17th century church was. So to be clear, this brick foundation is not the church, and it may not actually date to the initial time of the half-acre lot's donation, but eventually it was demarcating that area and certainly predates the construction of the current church, because in fact this wall would have been taken down before the construction of the wall you see today, which expanded the cemetery to incorporate the church in all of its size. So this map gives you a little bit more of a clear understanding. You can see where Abingdon Church is today, where the memorial garden is. In the upper left-hand corner of that map on the right-hand side are the burial tombs, the burials of Fairfield. Again, always going to highlight those guys. And then as you look down, you'll say, oh, what's all of that red? What are those lines that connect together? And that's what we found through probing with a brick probe, a glorified piece of rebar that we would poke into the ground and see if it hit something solid. And our excavations today are actually looking at that internal structure that we think might be associated with the earlier church. The three squares in blue are the sections that were exposed when the tree fell over during Hurricane Isabel. And all of the other black dots and the numbers correspond to the graves that are known that exist on the surface. And that, as we're looking at them today, that's a pretty large number of burials for an area that seems pretty empty. On the left-hand side, you can see two bricks. One that was a possible curved water table associated with the church, would have been demarcated the lower foundation from the foundation that extended up to the windows. Even more curious was a brick ball. And this is not a small one. This is about maybe 1 foot in diameter brick sphere, which was quite curious to find because there's not a lot of brick spheres out there. and not that many bored masons who are just making brick spheres for no good reason. What we do have a little hint about, though, is you can see in the sketch in the lower left-hand column, this is the Second Bruton Parish Church, which would be a contemporary of the church that we are looking at here. Not the one we're sitting in, but the one that we're excavating outside. And you can see around the churchyard wall, there's occasionally a small circle that looks like it might have been a decorative ornament on the top of a gate or an entryway. And in this case, I wonder, as heavy as it would have been, and as intimidating as it would have been to travel underneath, if it was some kind of finial or essentially decorative element sitting on top of one of these posts or entry points. So to summarize, here's another slide with a lot of words. And again, this is where we're excited about what has to come, not just your reading of this and asking us questions, but also looking at the work that is coming before us and asking, what could we learn? What is the most that could be brought about by this limited but very intensive excavation that will take place every spring and every fall for the next 3 years? At the time of this recording, which is a re-recording, spoiler alert, we're essentially about to backfill the first round of test units, and we're very grateful for all of the volunteers and the church congregants who came out and worked with us on those excavations as we found the southwest corner of the original church, as well as a cross wall that seems to be connected with an addition or appendage to the church. We're looking to come back in the fall of 2023 and to hopefully find out more by doing another round of public excavations and sharing some of that information with you, not only through lecture, but also through signage that we will erect on the site as the excavations proceed. If you have any questions, both about the 17th century land patent research or about the work we've done at Abingdon Church, you can see the links here. And if you can type them into your search bar, you can find more information as well as reach out to us and we can talk with you and hopefully answer those questions you might have. And I greatly appreciate all of the time and effort you have put into listening to this today and look forward to talking to you in the future. I think that's enough, right? All right. Thank you, guys.
I'm usually up here, and I hope the people there are as stimulated as I've been there from your presentation up here. So thank you very much for this very enlightening, engaging presentation. And when we laid out the series, we sort of by luck, but I note how you have touched on that growth of population with indentured and enslaved Africans particularly. In next week's lecture, by Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander is going to build on that theme, and so it's fortuitous we have those in place. The members of the Master Gardeners have slipped out and get our reception raised, so we have time for a few questions. Does anybody have a question that they'd like to ask, an observation? Jeannie?
Do you know the location of the Abingdon congregation before the church was built?
I am prone, so I'll repeat just in case. Do we know where the earlier church is? Do we know where the earlier congregation met prior to meeting here? Is that correct? Everything I've read has always indicated that it's basically to the east on one of the branches of the Severn, and that was a generally agreed upon central location. But no one's ever been able to tell or to show me a specific location with the material evidence to go ahead and to make it firm. And largely because church sites don't have a ton of archaeological remains. Normally we're looking at a lot of artifacts. You have to get pretty darn lucky to go ahead and find a spot that doesn't have a lot of trash. Now, as you get through time, the trash ends up, expanding exponentially, both through time as well as the number of people who are there. So the earliest congregation area is likely to have the least number of congregants. It's also likely to have some activity, but not a ton, and perhaps almost impossible to find. With all of the parishes in Gloucester as we understand it today, meaning if we just look at Abingdon, Ware, and Petsworth, we know the prior location, we basically know where all of the second churches are. And we know where the third churches are, 2 of them still standing. But we don't know where any of the first churches are. And that's problematic, and I think the only way we'll be able to find it is if there was one of 2 things. One is if someone died early enough, brought in a headstone, and then had it there. Or second, that somebody ended up finding it purely by accident. They would be one of the most impossible sites to find. I'd love it if there was, I guess a third option would be somebody has a document with a map and it shows where an X is. You know, we always dream about those things.
Well, I saw this hand first, and I'll come back over here.
Hello, I'm interested to know the status of your excavated finds. Where do they go after you've analyzed and recorded them? Do they belong to any particular agency?
A wonderful question. So the question of what happens to the stuff when we're done. So first, archaeology can take quite a while. There's the field component, then there's the laboratory analysis, and then there's sometimes the conservation of the materials that are found. So as an example, it sometimes takes 6 months to go ahead and to process the artifacts, sometimes longer, because depending on the organization that you work with and that their workload is, you don't always have the redundancy to be able to process things quickly. More importantly is the conservation, because metals and other things sometimes take a significant amount of time to conserve properly. And so if you found something of great significance, but also great research, that had sufficient integrity to be worthy of conservation, you know, those can sometimes take 1 year to 2 years, depending on the systems that are used, whether electrolysis or several others. The real answer, because I went off on a tangent there, is one that we learned from the Office of the Attorney General. In Virginia, the artifacts are the property of whoever owns the property at the time of excavation. And so everything that was excavated by us here is the property of the church. And it's whoever owns the church. So sometimes churches, the congregants own the church, sometimes other organizations own the church. It's whoever owns the property itself. If an excavation takes place on a private property owner's residence, there was a massive excavation that was done across many, many sites in the 1970s by something called the Gloucester County Archaeology Project. And almost all of the collections from that were left in a closet at Gloucester Point. I had the honor of being able to curate that collection as a graduate student in the late 1990s. And one of the problems became trying to track down all of the property owners, because it had been another 25 years since the time where the excavations took place. And for most folks, they had forgotten that the excavations had ever taken place or the property had changed hands. And so it was the attempt not only to connect with people who now own those properties, but also to connect with the people who once lived there at the time of excavation. Ultimately, the county took responsibility for the care and management of that collection, and still does. So I don't think it would have any problem with bringing those back to the people who rightfully own them, but they also don't have the resources to hunt everybody down and find them. So the hope in a situation like this with what we're planning is that at the end of the 3-year contract to go ahead and to do the seasonal excavations, everything would come back in a curation standard as set by the Department of Historic Resources, which is the state's Historic Preservation Office. And because it's a church, fingers crossed, it's going to not be a ton of artifacts, because it's great and exciting to find lots of stuff. But then when you know you have to take care of it for the rest of time, it's a daunting task. So we're hoping that there's a few boxes, a couple of items that hopefully are worthy of display and that will inspire future generations. And then, you know, essentially we'll bring them back to the church. And the church can make a decision as to where they would like to curate those. One option will always be the state of Virginia, although they have a always climbing box fee. I believe it's $375 per box. And at this moment, $375 is both outrageous as well as quite the bargain, because it is for the rest of time. And at the same time, you know, $375 for a bunch of trash that you found in your yard seems like it might be ludicrous. So other organizations, I know the Fairfield Foundation on occasionally takes collections on what they call indefinite loan. But really, I think the key is working with organizations to find the best curatorial facility. And We know that what Robert Kelly's been doing with the Gloucester Museum of History is certainly something that I've been impressed with. So I'm optimistic that he might be able to take collections in the future, particularly those that are endangered. Property owners who cannot care for them anymore, as opposed to, amazing church properties that hopefully have a couple of spaces for some boxes in the back room at least.
Judy.
I just noticed, I was a builder, and I noticed a lot of the old plats have 10 acres, more or less. So
Yeah.
most of those, I guess, recorded like that, more or less, since they didn't have a point to it.
And a lot of them are just drastically bad at counting acreage. Now, the funny thing about that is like, imagine if you had 100 acres that you patented, and then you found out 20 years later that it was 120 acres. Something tells me you may have figured that one out earlier and maybe decided not to let the folks at the county know. Because then you'd be paying taxes on 120 acres instead of 100. I mean, if you can think of the basic human tendency to want to try to, do everything you can to survive and to prosper, you can see how some discrepancies would prove both beneficial and really disappointing. Because the converse is equally true. You realize that you actually only have 80 acres, but you've been paying taxes on 100 acres for 35 years. That's going to take some getting used to. Yes or no questions are also welcome.
At this point in time, was there an Abingdon glebe?
Is there an Abingdon glebe? Okay, so maybe. So discussions about the glebe really come into the documents in the 1670s, 1680s. And so, yes, late 17th century, you have a glebe. The first glebe is shared by Ware and Abingdon. Does everyone here know what a glebe is? No? Nope. You do know? So basically, it's a farm that's earning income for the leader of the church. And so a lot of folks would be like, wait, isn't the glebe right next to the church? No. Our glebe is up the road. And Abingdon Glebe is, I think, the oldest standing building in Gloucester County. I would not quite stake my career on it, but pretty darn close. I think it's a 17th century building, and I think it's one of the few that survives in the state of Virginia. Luckily enough, it survives. I mean, it's glorious. We've done a lot of archaeology there. There seems to be all the indication that it could be something from the 1690s, 17 aughts, 1710s. It's formative in its architecture for right around that time. It also has closets, which is just a phenomenon that you don't see anyplace else. If any of you have been to Abingdon Glebe before, the tiny little appendages on the side, those are called closets. They're not the closets that you and I all know and adore and fill with junk. But those things were perfect, and thinking of them as a building that may have performed for more than just the role of earning income, it's a pretty fantastic architectural phenomenon. So it's one of my favorite buildings in the county. It's behind Ken Hout Chevrolet.
St. James Anglican Church currently worships in the Abingdon Glebe. So, Lynn, I think you had your hand up. I think maybe our last question.
2 questions.
Each with 49 individual parts.
In the archaeology that you personally have done in Gloucester County,
Yeah.
what is the most interesting, informative artifact that you have found?
Wow.
We know that the records of Gloucester County, including the records of this church, have been burned twice.
At least.
Is there not a corollary repository of records within the Church of England, Inc. that would house, well, we sent so-and-so to minister to those folks in what we're now calling Gloucester County?
All right. In traditional academic fashion, I will answer the questions out of order. I will go with the second one first. So, short answer, and this is my favorite answer of all time, I don't know. I encourage every one of my students to get comfortable with it, because the key isn't that you don't know, the key is that you'll find out. I've always been intrigued by the by the archives that exist in England that could shed a tremendous amount of light on what we have in America. I know that they've been digitizing collections left and right lately, and so I hold out a great deal of hope that all of the predecessors that came before me who were desperate for that information might be happy to see it come to light, whether they are looking down from above or looking over my shoulder. Because honestly, there's a tremendous amount of amazing researchers that we are just in awe of what they were able to do before the internet, before a lot of the research resources available, and tons of librarians who are constantly searching for this just to make it available. Not because they actually care about the specifics of what they're providing, but because they care about the people who they're providing it to. But I don't know. I mean, we do have correspondence and other things that talk right around the Revolutionary War, because the pastor at the church is a sympathizer with the English. So at that point, we know that there's some correspondence, but tracking back to see who the earlier correspondences may have had, because some of it came through about the sharing of Abingdon glebe. That was another kind of issue, which wasn't unheard of, because you could only supply the amount of income for but so many folks during that time. Eventually, where glebe is established, and they separate from there. The first one is always an extremely fun answer to give, but it's like, how do you pick between your children kind of thing? I love amazing things that I've found over my lifetime, and you've put some constraints on it, so I have to go ahead and think about it for a second. Because I found a bunch of things that are not in Gloucester, and they were really cool. And it's my go-to stuff. So, it can be a tough thing, because like every day that we were at Werowocomoco, it felt special. And so in some cases, it was just finding a specific artifact that wasn't very noteworthy, that would make you feel connected to something that, I have no real connection to in any other way, other than I'm on the spot where, an amazing historic event happened. And, I can now try to imagine what those moments were like. And then be in awe of the deep history that I'm not even thinking about. But some of the most amazing stuff that we've found, whether it's at Fairfield or at the Gloucester Courthouse or Abingdon Glebe, we used to run a kids camp there with them, and that's where we were doing a lot of the archaeology. Or Gloucester Point, for that matter. I'm almost always the person next to the person finding the cool stuff. So we found a luggage plate for a colonel, a British colonel in the Revolutionary War who was stationed there. Anna Rhodes found it, or one of the other crew members on the spot. My apologies to them for not remembering the name. Michelle Brumfield, I think it's between the two of them, they found it. And within, I think, 48 hours, we found a descendant. Yeah, and they came. They lived in North Carolina, and they were just like, I'm getting in the car. So most of the stuff that we find that's really kind of special is the stuff that immediately connects with people. So anytime you've got a name on it, it's going to make the list. There's a signet ring that we found at Fairfield, and then I got depressed because we learned that it was both 19th century, and it's also for someone who we have no idea who it is. It doesn't match to anybody. It's TG. And I always joke that it was Thomas Jefferson, but spelt wrong. But those are the kind of things that, honestly, anytime one of the kids that works with us comes up and hands us a nail and says, "This is cool, what can you tell me about it?" It wins.
Nice.
It's up to him. He controls.
Ask it when you're over there, because then talk loud over there, because the master gardeners are like, we've got everything ready. We want people to come over there. I made promise that we would go there, and so here are things. Just a couple things to tie on to that last couple questions. Lynn, I would pose that question to Dr. Pritchard in 2 weeks, because he'll be speaking about the Church of England, and his research may help that. What are the trove of records information that may be on that side that he has insight to in his research? So that's a good place. But then your first question, I'm doing the same thing you did, first one. Just to make clear, there's a partnership between Abingdon Church and the Fairfield Foundation for this dig that you've heard David refer to a few times, and that'll be taking place twice a year. Our intent is to have it done when school is in session, so that elementary schools and middle schools can coordinate to come here, as well as people can sort of see things as it is evolving in that dig. And so in April and the fall of each year for the next 3 years. And so we'll be working to get the word out on when those are taking place. We've already set the first one, and you'll be seeing that communications from the church, probably from Fairfield and other places, so that we really do encourage you to come and see what's coming up in this site that we're looking forward to digging so much. And I'm certainly grateful that you've been here with us today and given up your time and help us uncover the story of what was taking place when this church was founded. So thank you. Thank you very much.